This is module 4, which is the Indigenous Tribes of California. Objectives for the entire training altogether is that participants will be able to define adverse childhood experiences. And we talked about that in depth yesterday, but that's looking at the 10 categories. In addition to that, we talked about other social determinants of health, such as racial discrimination, for example, economic status, separation from parents. We talked about those pieces that are also impactful on toxic stress. Another goal is that people will be able to describe how providing trauma-informed care for Indigenous communities of California must include an understanding of their histories. And this relates to intergenerational transmission of adversity, factors for toxic stress, and protective factors from an Indigenous perspective. And that's kind of what we're going to be targeting in our discussion today. Also, and thinking about the whole kind of focus and goal of this training is really to encourage medical professionals to screen for ACEs and treatment of toxic stress. And so throughout this training, I like to encourage you to really think about making connections between what you've experienced in core trainings or in your field and how it relates to information being shared about Indigenous communities. So for example, while engaging in Objective 2, which is describing how providing trauma-informed care for Indigenous communities of California must have an understanding of the histories, to think about how you might select a screening tool or how you might provide trauma-informed care or help patients heal from harmful consequences of toxic stress in these communities. So really challenging ourselves to not only take in the information, but think about what does this mean for us specifically as professionals and within our field, the work that we do with children and families. So many people from different diverse backgrounds participate in the training. Some are medical professionals, some work in community health, some are in social work, some work with children in the schools, but really thinking about what all this information actually means to you. And so I've showed this slide a couple of times already, but it's talking about what are the trauma-informed principles and thinking about trauma-informed care. And so when we talk about establish the physical and emotional safety of patients, and staff, what does that actually mean in an Indigenous community? What does it mean to establish physical and emotional safety? And in order to do that, remember, we talked about self-reflecting, we talked about our own bias, we talked about our own worldview. Just because we feel safe doesn't necessarily mean that our clients will feel safe. And so what does it mean then to really establish physical and emotional safety for our patients? And once again, sometimes that means looking beyond our own comfort and our own safety levels, building trust between providers and patients. How do we build trust and understanding that trust for people, and we'll be talking about this, and there's some testimonials to this, is that trust for some is a different pathway than for others, and really understanding what that means to build trust. Also, in recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma exposure on physical and mental health is part of what we're talking about today when we talk about the intergenerational transmission of adversity, understanding what that actually means. As we discussed today, sometimes people may be of the train of thought that what happens in the past is in the past, but we will learn in our discussions throughout the rest of this week is that these events actually can impact the not only behavioral but biological health of a person. And so we'll be talking about that as well today. And so we learned in the previous modules that every human being has a view of the world. And this view, as we said, is like a lens, a pair of glasses that influence our perceptions of reality. And so when we take a healthy risk to nurture a space for an alternative perspective, we're sometimes enlightened with new information. And we talked about this as being a multi-logical kind of perspective, that there can be multiple truths, multiple experiences, and that they don't have to compete with each other. And that was part of module 3, is that they can coexist. Multiple perspectives can coexist. And so when we're speaking of scientific perspective, we can also include Indigenous perspectives, and there will be things that are similar and things that enrich each other in the process. And so that's what we're doing here today. And so one thing to really be aware of when we think about serving Indigenous peoples, California Indigenous peoples, is having an understanding of who California Indigenous peoples are. And so in 2019, the U.S. Census Bureau reported that there's 321,112 Indigenous peoples in the state of California. And California has the largest population of Indigenous peoples in the United States. 12,559 of those are in Humboldt County, and 3,033 are in Del Norte County. And so we're in a highly populated, very rich part of the country of Indigenous peoples. It's also important to know that there are 109 federally recognized tribes in the state of California. So California is a very diverse state, and including several tribes that have lands that actually cross what would be called the state of California boundaries. So you can see in this map how the homelands of different tribes actually go into Nevada, actually go into Arizona. These are the traditional homelands of these places. And it's also important to know that there are 115 different Indigenous languages in what is now known as California. And so sometimes when speaking to Indigenous people, sometimes you might say, oh, do you speak Indian? I'm putting that in quotes as that's a generalization. That there actually are 115 different languages in California alone, Indigenous languages. You can also find, if you go to, and you can see here, it says native-california.us. That's a place that you can go to see more of the different tribal homelands, but you can also identify the tribal homelands to which you may reside or where you may work, and be able to see what tribes are traditionally from, or which homelands are you currently inhabiting. And so then when we look at the northern region of California, these are some of the tribes listed here. And so according to Indian Health Service's most recent data, federally recognized tribes of the northern region include all of these that you see listed here. And so in this discussion, it's also important to recognize that there are many tribes that are recognized by the federal government, and these tribes are referred to as federally recognized tribes. And this is something that you could actually have a whole class on, and talking about what it means to be a federally recognized tribe. But just to talk about it real quickly, is that federally recognized tribes have a trust relationship with the federal government. And so the Administration for Native Americans states that trust responsibility is a legal principle that the Supreme Court noted, and that was in the United States versus Mitchell. It's undisputed existence of a general trust relationship between the United States and Indian people. And so this trust doctrine is a source of federal responsibility to Indians, requiring the federal government to support tribal self-government, and a source when we think of economic prosperity. So duties that stem from the government's guarantees to protect Indian tribes and respect their sovereignty. And so in working in some of your professions, you may notice that there's different funding or that sort of thing that's coming in for federally recognized tribes. This is a part of the government to government relationship. It's part of the trust responsibility, the federal government's obligation to Indigenous tribes. Which includes the economic and social well-being Indigenous peoples as well. And so what you see here listed are a list of federally recognized tribes that are in the northern region of California. It's also important to note that there are tribes that are pending federal recognition that could be state recognized tribes, and they also may not be recognized by the state and still pending. And right now there's over 100 tribes that are seeking federal recognition. And so once again, 109 federally recognized tribes in the United States. This is a list here of the northern region of California, and then 115 different Indigenous languages. And so when we're speaking of Indigenous peoples and when we're talking about this training, it's important to understand that we don't want to generalize the diversity of people. People are very different. They have different histories, different experiences, different worldviews and epistemologies, as we talked about yesterday. But at the same time, there are some commonalities. And so we're trying to pull together today some of the commonalities that you may see. And so my Uncle Jack, he quotes Isel Luis and saying the telling and in the telling and in the listening, humanity meets. And I think this is a really important way of thinking and understanding. And so in order to really understand the intergenerational transmission of adversity, it's important to be exposed to the historical experiences of Indigenous peoples in California. And so the next few slides, we're going to be giving kind of a brief overview of this information. Once again, you can get a PhD in this type of information. And so what we're sharing today is a very much an introductory level. But it's important to note that through this process, that some of the material may trigger emotions in you that might mirror the 7 stages of grief. And so as you're being exposed to this new information, and for some it may be information you've already been exposed to, that it might be difficult, and there might be moments of discomfort. And that's when we talk about in the telling and the listening, humanity meets, is that when a person experiences a trauma and they're able to share and describe and talk about that trauma, it's so important in the healing process. And it's so important to have those that will listen. And in the telling and in the listening is where humanity meets. And so I want to give a trigger warning with this, because the module will describe some experience of genocide that might be difficult to hear, or may cause minor discomfort. And so a story that I like to share with my students about feeling difficult information and feeling this minor discomfort is I think about when we exercise. And many of you are familiar with social media and that sort of thing. But if I'm going to go and exercise, you know, I might get all the necessary gear that's needed, you know, the outfit, the water bottle, the whole thing, the headband, that sort of thing, and go and get on the treadmill. And I might post maybe a Snapchat that I'm on my way to work out, you know, going to put in some tough time. And so then I get on the treadmill and I set it maybe at 2.0, and I just kind of stroll along, and I continue strolling along. And pretty soon I start to feel like a little uncomfortable. So I just jump off the treadmill and I'm done. But I do this every day for a month. And after 30 days, I jump on the scale, you know, and I want to see like, what is the improvement? Because I've been working out really hard for a whole month and there's no improvement. And I'm so disappointed. I can't understand, because I did everything that I was supposed to do. But one thing I did also do was stay within my own comfort zone. I didn't really push myself. So what might have been is if I were to get on the treadmill and maybe not advertise to everyone that I'm doing it, but I'm just doing it. And I put it up a little bit, you know, maybe 2.4, 2.6. When I start to feel that feeling that I'm tired or uncomfortable, that little bit of discomfort, if I continue to push myself, then over time, I start to experience the growth. And maybe after 30 days, I don't even have the desire to jump on the scale because I'm feeling so good. Or maybe I do and I see the results. And so this is the story I usually tell my students, because when we're learning, it can be uncomfortable. And in order for us to grow, though, that discomfort, we can embrace it, and it can be important in our personal growth. And so as we learn about these historical events, sometimes it might make us uncomfortable. It might be something different than what we've heard before, or it might be something that that we're saddened by or angered by. But this discomfort is important because over time, it does help you to grow. At the same time, when you jump on the treadmill, you don't want to jump on it and, go 8 miles per hour, and you're going at a steep incline, and you're just so extremely uncomfortable. And so that's what I ask of you, is that we challenge ourselves to be, have a little bit of discomfort. But if you are feeling extreme discomfort, to be sure to communicate that with me in the chat, or also feel free to step away and then to come back if you feel that that's needed. We as human beings, our emotional responses can vary. And that's what this chart is all about, is that as I share some information, some people may feel this feeling of shock. And so that's like a feeling of initial paralysis, where you feel like you can't respond or you can't do anything. Some may feel denial, and trying to avoid the inevitable. And for that reason, on every slide, there are citations. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have as many pictures and we have more words. So you can actually see these words for yourself. And you also can see the citation so that you know where you can follow up to learn more information. It's a natural response. Another response that you might feel is anger. As you hear information, it might be this frustrated outpouring of emotion. Knowing that's a part of human response, it's okay. We don't expect that you have any particular response as you're listening to this information, because it's going to vary. Some people may feel bargaining, and that's where we seek in vain for a way out. And so when we hear information, we process it and we're thinking, okay, but what if this? Or maybe it's because of this, and we bargain to try to find a way out. Others might feel depressed, that sense of hopelessness, sometimes even fear, with this final realization of the inevitable. Some may be at a point of testing where they're already seeking realistic solutions, and others who have been exposed to much of this information may be at a point of acceptance. And when we talk about acceptance, is not saying that, oh, it's all done now, I'm not worried about it or concerned about it anymore, it's all okay. It's not saying that, but acceptance is being able to take in information and start thinking about those realistic solutions and what our individual role might be in supporting positive changes. And so as human beings, we also can fluctuate. As we're learning information, you might feel shocked, then you might feel anger, then you might feel depression, and then you might feel denial. And that's all part of the human response as well. And so in the information that we'll be talking about today, just knowing that whatever emotions that you feel, that it's okay. It's part of being a human. And eventually we will get to that stage of acceptance, where we can see our own personal role and what it is that we can do to support and promote positive change. And so then first thinking about our investment of time. Why is history important? And usually in a group, I would ask different people to kind of think about that. Of course, I have all of these responses written up here, but think about, why is it that we should learn history? And why would it be important in a trauma-informed care setting? Why would it be important for us to understand and know a little bit about the history of the area? And so these are just some of the reasons why it could be important. And when I think about responses that I've heard from people before when I've asked this question, and one is that it acknowledges that Indigenous people have always had their own form of education and child rearing practices. And so oftentimes that the period of pre-contact and looking at child rearing practices among Indigenous peoples, sometimes that's erased in the narrative, or it's not present in the narrative. And talking about rite of passage ceremonies, for example, when young people become of age, or healing practices, or of philosophies, Indigenous knowledge around the relationships with the natural environment. Sometimes these things aren't really recognized or acknowledged in the mainstream narratives, textbooks, stories that were commonly told. And so learning history helps us to be exposed to that. It also exposes us to the political and cultural oppression, genocide, forced assimilation, and religious conversion that undoubtedly has impact on the current social and emotional issues of Indigenous people. And that's where we talk about this intergenerational transmission of adversity, and how toxic stress has impacted Indigenous peoples. Another is, and we talked about this very briefly with trust responsibility, but it recognizes the government has a moral and legal obligation through its trust responsibility to Indigenous peoples. And some people are unaware of that. And it's important, especially when you're working for government agencies, for example. History also identifies different reports and legislation that support the integration of language, culture, and community involvement, that in response to a lot of history, for example, the Indian Child Welfare Act, in response to boarding schools and children being separated from their families and their communities, there's different legislation that has come out to prevent these types of things from happening again. But in order to really make those pieces of legislation effective, we have to understand the history and the reasons why those legislation came into being in the first place. And finally, and these are my two favorite, is that it addresses the resiliency and responsibility of our young people. Is that as we talk through this history, and as you're exposed to some of the phases in looking at pre-contact, genocide, colonial education, relocation, to remember that Indigenous peoples are here. And we talked about not just here, but we're looking at hundreds of thousands in the state of California alone, and that Indigenous peoples have survived. And with that comes responsibility for the descendants of those survivors. It also, in talking about history, allows healing. It creates space for healing. That in being able to share and talk about traumas and to be able to address it begins that process of healing. And as long as history is not talked about, is not acknowledged, then their barrier is created for people to be able to begin these steps and these phases of healing. And so these are just a few of the reasons of why history is important, why it's important in trauma-informed care, why it's important in our relationships and our connections with Indigenous communities. And there's many more reasons why this would also be important as well. So when we think about these phases, and we think about in the basket story that was shared in module 2, Kem Tem, the basket that holds the treasures of the people. And in that story, it talked about through prayer, she began to weave a basket for the people. And her baskets were woven so tight that water could not penetrate them. And so she placed the basket in the river and stood silent as the basket began its journey. And in every weave of the basket was a treasure, a story to be told, a song to be sung, a lesson to be shared. And it was watertight that she placed in the basket as it began the journey down the river and went through all these different generations. And we think of that is that Indigenous communities have always had their own knowledge, their own pedagogy, and their own child rearing practices. And despite some of our stereotypes that we hear at different times about things like Indian time or Indian summer, that Indigenous communities have always been a very orderly people and have always had very specific timelines that were in relationship and connection with the natural environment. And so when you think about hunting and you think about gathering, ceremonial calendars, all of these aspects of Indigenous knowledge are closely connected with the natural environment, very orderly. And prior to contact, teaching was provided in a safe and nurturing environment by parents, extended family, and community. And children were taught methods of survival, oral tradition, custom, and how to live in balance with the world. And it's important to note that each California tribe has their own homeland, creation stories, and place of origin. And when I speak of place of origin, I mean where they came into creation. And some refer to this as the center of the world. So in Northern California, for example, the Hupa story of origin describes their creation at Tacamelden, which is a Hupa village. And from a Hupa philosophy, Hupa people have always been there. And so this contradicts and goes against the idea of the land bridge theory, which now is even further being proven wrong. It goes against any theories of migration. And along with that, the Honta Nikiao, which is a big house at Tacamelden, it's been carbon dated 8 to 12,000 years. And so when we think about, and we talked about this in a couple of modules ago, is we think about this connection of Indigenous peoples to these homelands being 12,000 years and beyond. And we also know that the exact population of Indigenous Californians prior to contact is really unknown. And so in some texts, you'll read that there was around 300,000 California Indigenous peoples time prior to contact. In other texts, you'll read that there was 1 million California Indigenous peoples prior to contact. But regardless of the exact number of Indigenous Californians, it's undisputed that these people had their own villages, trading systems, agriculture, trails, and forms of land stewardship prior to any European contact. So it's important to remember that Indigenous peoples have always had their own worldviews and epistemologies that have sustained them. And that's part of that basket story, is that in every weave was a piece of this knowledge that she placed into the river, and it was watertight, and it survived through every generation. And these are the generations that we'll be talking about here in these next few slides. And so one of the first phases that Indigenous peoples experienced was this period of genocide. And so although Columbus arrived in Hispaniola in 1492, he never traveled to the main continent, and he never set foot on the state of California. And as a matter of fact, Indigenous peoples of California did not have contact with Indigenous people, non-Indigenous peoples, until the late 16th century. And in Northern California, in some places, it wasn't until the mid 19th century. So this is 350 years later than we talk about Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And so 315 years later, so consequently, California has a real unique and diverse history from the rest of the United States. And so one Indigenous elder told me that, that we're fortunate that we're not exposed to non-natives until much later than the rest of the country. However, we're less fortunate in that the government was very good at their tactics by the time that they reached us. And Jack Norton, who wrote Genocide in Northwest California in 1979, adds to that by the time settlers reached California, they had confidently developed an attitude of privilege, entitlement, and justification for their genocidal acts. And so Cabrillo in 1542, Drake in 1579, Aguilar in 1602, Vizcaino in 1603, they were among the first people to ever voyage to the California coast, and that was the southern California coast. And according to their journals, Indigenous Californians met them with open arms, provided them with food, and cared for them when they were sick. And in return, and you can see Stannard in his book in 1992, which he calls American Holocaust, he says in return, people were exposed to violence and disease. And he says in raping Native women and merely breathing on Native men, the marching Spanish soldiers spread syphilis and gonorrhea, smallpox and influenza everywhere they went. And so these diseases took a devastating toll on Indigenous populations, and the decline impacted the population for the next century. So disease in combination with genocide resulted in a decline of 98% of the Indigenous peoples of California. And so when we look at this term genocide, Dr. Rose Soza Wolsholger, she's a professor in history and ethnic studies at Sacramento State University. We asked her to answer this question for the training is what is genocide and what does that really mean? So I'd like to share with you her definition and description of genocide here.
I am Mountain Maidu, Kuya, and Liseño. I'm an enrolled member of Saboba Band de Liseño Indians. On my mother's side, she is from the Susanville Indian Rancheria. And on my father's side, Kuya and Liseño are from Saboba.
So the definition of genocide and the reason that it should be used, the term genocide itself was created by a Polish lawyer in 1944, and he came up with this definition to really sort of define mass death that would be occurring sort of around the world. And while many people associate it specifically with the Jewish population and the Holocaust, his definition never sort of limited it as far as ethnicity, sort of regionality, or race at all. And so when it comes to the worldwide sort of recognized definition of genocide, this was passed by the United Nations in 1948. And so it outlined a number of key areas that would qualify for an instance or a series of events to fall into the definition of genocide. And so one is the killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And so when you look at this definition of genocide, and when it comes to California, there really is no other definition or word that you could use to describe the historical experience of California Native people under the rule of not only the Spanish Empire, but also the Mexican Empire, and then finally the American Empire. And this is something that is at times, I believe, uncomfortable for people to really sort of recognize and come to this conclusion, but really to understand the purpose of this term and what it is defining, and how this then has a sort of a legacy, across what we now call California. So the first civilian governor of California who was elected, Peter Burnett, he came from Kentucky. He came from a slave owning family. Once he was an adult, he traveled and lived in Missouri briefly. And then he also lived in Oregon, where he supported legislation that would determine that no Black people would be able to legally live in Oregon. He supported that legislation. And when you look at the early history of California, what becomes known as California, a lot of the political leaders came from Oregon and carried with them their sort of racist ideologies that they brought either from back east or from their experience being in Oregon. And so when you have Governor Burnett, who was the first civilian governor of California, issue his State of the State address in 1851, part of his speech, he literally comes out and says, quote, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. End quote. And so you can actually locate his speech in its entirety online through the governor's office. And so again, this is Peter Burnett, and sort of within his State of the State address in 1851, he goes on to continue and talk about the extermination. And so to be clear, no one is using the word genocide. It doesn't exist at that time period, but sort of what he is defining and describing is sort of wholesale violence, and sort of this idea that there's nothing that can be done about it. To be very clear, not every person who comes to California supports what is going on. You have a series of newspaper editorials, for example, that question the high rates of violence and the bounties that are being paid to these voluntary militia groups who prove death. But to be very clear, right, this is still something that is going on. And so you have the state of California reimburse these voluntary militias who again are being paid for being Indian killers. You then had the state of California being reimbursed by the federal government. So they provided reimbursement for all weapons and all ammunition. Simultaneously in California, it is actually against state law. It is illegal for California Native people to testify in a court of law against any white person. And it is also illegal for any California Native person to be in possession or to own guns or ammunition. And indeed, this stays on the legal books in California when it comes to California Native people owning guns. That actually stays on the books until 1913. And so when you look at the history of California, and there has been a lot of publications about under Spanish rule, under Mexican rule, there's been less written about under American rule. And to really sort of be aware of history, to understand the terms, to sort of understand the legal definition of genocide, and really why to use any other term doesn't make any sense. When you have bounties that are being paid for, that is supported by the state, that is reimbursed by the federal government, right? The deliberate causing of death, the deliberate removing of children, preventing women from reproducing, all of these things that were occurring under American rule fulfill the definition of what is worldwide recognized as the legal definition of genocide as provided by the United Nations back in 1948.
So I just want to give you kind of a minute to process that information. And if this was a class, I would do breakout rooms so that you could discuss it, but just kind of take a minute to kind of process so far what has been discussed. And if you have questions, you can go ahead and put those in the chat also. The definition from the 1948 Convention on the Prevention of Punishment of Genocide of genocide is killing members of the group, causing serious or bodily harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent birth, forcibly transferring children of a group to another group. And so the experiences of Indigenous peoples of California meets every single one of the criterias in the definition. And so each of them was a common practice in California history. And so, for example, in Southern California, the mission San Diego de Alcala became the first of 21 Franciscan missions that were established in 1769. And so the Franciscan missions were founded by the Roman Catholic Church, and they were actually led by Father Junipero Serra, who was actually canonized recently. And this was between 1713 and 1784. And their idea was to create a civilization, I'm putting this in quotes, from wilderness. And so Spanish troops captured and herded Indigenous Californians to these missions to be imprisoned, baptized, and then often killed immediately after. And so you can look at Stannard's book, American Holocaust, and that came out in 1992, and you'll get more description on this. Also, you can look at Costo's work, Robert Costo, in 1986, and you can read more about this as well. But in a study of more than 11,000 Chumash children who experienced the Santa Barbara, La Purisma, and Santa Ynez missions in the late 18th century, data shows, and you can see here on the slide, that 36% of those Chumash children who weren't yet 2 years old when they entered the mission died in less than 12 months. And 2/3 died before reaching the age of 5. So 3 of 4 children died before attaining puberty. And in short, the missions were furnaces of death. And that's also comes from Stannard. And so when we think about the missions, sometimes we don't hear about this part of the history within the California missions. And California missions continued from 1769 into 1834. And during this period of time, the native birth rate decreased to 3.5%, and the death rate increased 70 to 85%. And the overall population of Indigenous Californias during the period of missions, 1713 to 1784, decreased by 50%. And so in thinking about this is what's happening in Southern California in missions. In Northern California, contact happened much later. In 1848, on PB Reading's journey through Hoopa, also called the Hoopa Valley, he discovered gold along the river. And so by 1850, you have an influx of people that are coming into California. And California became a state at the time. Hundreds and thousands of miners, land speculators traveled to Northern California, and even from places like San Francisco. And so Norton, in his book, Genocide in Northwest California, 1979, says that these aggressive invaders of the 1850s saw the valleys and forests as obstructions to their goal of manifest destiny. They were instructed by scripture, they said, reinforced by success, and driven by rank individualistic will to believe they were destined to be civilizers of the earth. They were charged to go forth upon this earth and subdue it. This was their belief and the foundation of their religion. And so sometimes when we think of this type of information, we're talking about what happened in Southern California and what's happening in Northern California. We're thinking about the time of contact, people that are coming in and looking for, resources. And at the same time, there's the extermination policies that are happening where people are being paid for the scalps of Indigenous people. Sometimes when we hear these things, it's hard to make the connection with how each one of these events impacts children, families, and communities. You think about, for example, a child being taken away from their home and putting into a mission. We talked about this happening with thousands and thousands of children, but what would it be like for us to lose one child? And sometimes it's important to think about how children and families are impacted at this time, because children that experience this, these are traumatic events that impact their own well-being. And we look at different studies. We look at studies of fear factor, for example, and something like a study in a rat and looking at a fear factor of a rat that's been exposed to traumatic incidences, that fear factor in that rat can travel it up to 7 generations. So the rat's offspring could then experience a traumatic, would think they experience a traumatic event. Their body would respond in the same way, even if an event wasn't traumatic. So then you compare and you think about children and families who are experiencing these events. How did that impact their behavioral health, their biological health, and how in turn does that impact generations that follow them? And so Lucy Tchetsa Young, she's a Lasik woman from what is now referred to as Southern Humboldt, Mendocino counties in Northern California. She was a young girl at the time of European contact, and she was born in 1846, and she lived to be 94 years old to tell her story. And she says in one of her quotes, in her entire story, I would encourage you all to read her entire story. It's published by Eric Smith in 1990, but this is just one piece. And she says, "You ask about father. He got killed, and brother in soldier war before soldiers captured us. 3 days fight, 3 days running, just blood, blood, blood. Young woman, cousin, run from soldier, run into our camp. Young woman been stole by white people, come back. Front skin hang down like apron. She tied up with cotton dress, never die neither. White people want our land, want destroy us. Break and burn all our basket, break our pounding rock, destroy our ropes. No snares, no deerskin, flint knife, nothing." And so when you think of this, and she's telling her story of what she remembers as a child, what she remembers about the time of contact, and thinking about how this impacts her as a child. And so, when you read this about front skin hang down like an apron, you think about during this period of time, there's bounties on Indigenous peoples, that you could scalp an Indigenous person and sell that scalp. And in some documentation, there's even incidences of people actually skinning Indigenous peoples. And so what she's sharing here is a really important testimony to history and what she saw, that front skin hanging down like an apron, but that this person lived. And so after Lucy Tchetsa Young's camp was invaded, her brother and father were killed in that invasion. She was then captured by soldiers, and she managed to escape, and she fled into the mountains. And she utilized her knowledge of the environment and cultural skills to be able to survive. And with these skills, she was able to find water, shelter, and medicine. And Tchetsa sang ceremonial songs, and she talks about singing these songs for self-soothing. And she utilized her ability to speak multiple languages, because at this period of time, people would speak the language of those when they went into their homelands, they would speak their languages. And so she utilized her knowledge of multiple languages to be able to communicate with local tribes and to be able to find safety. So during the span of her childhood, Tchetsa witnessed murder. She suffered the loss of her brother, her father, and later the rest of her family and village. She experienced slavery. She was sold to a farmer at 12 years old to be a wife. And so, knowing though that she lived to be 94 years old, and thinking once again, when we talk about, and we'll talk about this more in the next module, the intergenerational transmission of adversity. How was she as a child impacted by these experiences? And how do these experiences influence or impact her children and her children's children? Another story is Sally Bell. And Sally Bell is a Sinkyone woman, and she was also a child at the time of contact. And she shares her experience from the early 1860s, and this was in Needle Point, California. She says, "My grandfather and all of my family, my mother, my father, and we were around the house and not hurting anyone. Soon, about 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. I was a big girl at the time. Then they killed my baby sister and cut her heart out and threw it in the brush where I ran and hid. My little sister was a baby, just crawling around. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared that I guess I just hid there a long time, with my little sister's heart in my hands. I felt so bad and I was so scared that I just couldn't do anything else. Then I ran into the woods and I hid there for a long time. I lived a long time with a few people that had got away. We lived on berries and roots, and we didn't dare build a fire because the white man might come after us. So we ate anything we could get. We didn't have clothes a while. We had to sleep under logs and hollow trees because we didn't have anything else to cover ourselves with, and it was cold then in the spring. And so in thinking about Sally Bell's story is not only thinking about the trauma that a child experiences watching her family members being killed, witnessing her sister being tortured, holding her heart for days, thinking about how this impacts the development of a child, this experience. But then at the same time, thinking about how both Techetza and Sally survived. And they both survived by utilizing the treasures of their people. They survived by their knowledge of how to live in the mountains, how to get water, how to gather medicines, how to cope. That their own indigenous knowledge is what helped them to survive and get through that experience. And that's another important piece to this discussion, is not just the experience and how it impacts intergenerationally, but also the strengths. What were the protective factors from an indigenous perspective? What were the tools used to help these children to get through these circumstances? And it comes back to Kem Tim, the treasures of our people, the indigenous knowledge that was woven into this basket and left for the people. And although this is a Yurok story, and although it's a story that describes this basket in this way, the idea is that indigenous peoples from many different spaces all have this knowledge that is transferred from generation to generation. And it's important when we're speaking from an indigenous perspective of what a protective factor would be. And so despite treaties that guaranteed indigenous Indian safety and protection, the state of California paid $1 million for Indian scalps in 1 year. And in San Francisco in 1852, as Dr. Soza War Soldier was saying, that Governor Peter Burnett stated in his annual message that, and you can see on the slide, a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. So it was a part of policy at this time to exterminate indigenous peoples. And this message not only encouraged the military, but also local settlers to plan their own attacks on indigenous Californians. So likewise, California residents raised $400,000 in bonds to pay for militia expeditions. And in many circumstances, local residents would raid villages during ceremonies or late at night, the night when families were sleeping. And so the Indian Island Massacre, for example, at Tuluwat of the Wiyot people in 1860, it occurred during their ceremony to pray for the continuance of mankind and the renewal of the world. And so you can see on this slide is actually a quote from the Northern Californian, which was a newspaper article, and this was printed on February 29th, 1860. It said whites had taken their boats again and left the island without being observed by any persons except those in league with them. But the spectacle they left behind them was horrible. Blood stood in pools on all sides. The walls of the huts were stained and the grass colored red. Lying around were dead bodies of both sexes and all ages, from the old man to the infant at the breast. Some had their heads split in twain by axes, others beat into jelly with clubs, others pierced or cut to pieces with bowie knives. Some struck down as mired, others had almost reached the water when overtaken and butchered. And so thinking of this being printed in a newspaper article and these descriptions that you see here. And I think one thing that's important to really notice in this is when we talk about of all ages, from the old man to the infant at the breast. And so sometimes in narratives, we hear about history and a picture is painted of heathen, of violent indigenous peoples that are attacking. And I think this gives an example. We're talking about from the old man to the infant at the breast. Also in the Indian Island Massacre, that in the Alta, California newspaper, it said that the attacking party rushed upon them, blowing out their brains, splitting their heads open. Little children in baskets and even babies had their head smashed to pieces and cut open. And that's in Forbes 1968. You can also read more testimonials and in articles about babies being impaled on sticks and roasted around the fire. So this is the kind of inhumane history of people. And when we're talking about locally in Humboldt County at this time is what we're discussing. So in addition to murder, nearly 10,000 Indigenous Californians were indentured or sold as slaves between 1850 and 1863. And some people are unaware of slavery in Humboldt County. But on October 22nd, 1850, an act for the government protection of Indians established within its 20 various sections the mechanism whereby Indians of all ages could be indentured or apprenticed to any white citizen. And so although this act was amended to make kidnap, sale of children, and indentured servitude illegal in 1860, the practice still continued for several more years. And so here on this slide, you can see some of these citations to kind of help you to follow along. So from 1855 to 1864, there were multiple accounts of kidnapping and selling of Indians. And Hoopa children, for example, were kidnapped and sold in the local town for $25 each. A letter from an Indian agent to the superintendent of Indian Affairs said that I've just learned a man, and you can see it listed here, I've just learned that a man has stolen a woman and 2 boys and intends to sell them or trade them for cattle, which has been much practice as of late. And then another letter reads, the Spanish stole 20 or 25 young women and killed 1. And so despite the multiple attempts by the government and California residents to exterminate Indigenous peoples, once again, it's important to note that their efforts were unsuccessful. And we talked about the numbers of Indigenous peoples that currently reside in California today. And when we think about this basket, Chem-Tem, Indigenous knowledge, that this basket, through its journey down the river, that it survived this European inflicted disease, it survived the Franciscan missions, murder, rape, slavery, the period of the gold rush. And it moved along ever so quickly and purposeful through the eddies. And so as we talk about these pieces and we're feeling these different emotions as we're talking about, just kind of taking a moment to reflect and thinking where you kind of lie, are you feeling kind of feelings of shock? Are you feeling denial, anger, bargaining, depression, in this kind of space of testing that every human has different emotions. And so whatever you're feeling at this time, that those emotions, embrace them because it means that you're a human being. But also in thinking about this is that the point of teaching it is not to instill a feeling of anger, for example. It's about healing. It's about talking about and having these discussions to move to the space of healing and understanding. And when we look at trauma-informed care, it's important to provide safe spaces, to build trust, to be able to work with our clients. We have to understand the history of where our clients are coming from and what has impacted their worldview, their values, their beliefs, and their experiences. And so there's yet another phase that Indigenous peoples of California have gone through. And this is the phase of relocation. And so the relocation of Indigenous peoples began with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, where tribes were first forcibly moved from their homelands. And oftentimes in history books, when we hear about this, we might hear of the Trail of Tears, for example. What some people are unaware of is that there's multiple trails of tears that occurred throughout the United States. There's multiple long walks where people were taken from their homelands and moved to reservations and to other places. So between 1832 and 1843, Eastern tribes that had already been relocated to reservations were relocated once again further west. And in California, settlers wanted the Indians relocated, as Eastern tribes have been, and moved to places like Oklahoma. However, the concept of relocation posed a dilemma in California since there was nowhere further west to go. Not to mention that tribes such as Hoopa were also very adamant about staying in their homelands and very active within that. So despite the dilemma, the government identified that there was two choices: that they could exterminate all the native peoples, or it could place them on reservations and domesticate them. And the second, they argued, was far more practical, since it would be cheaper to feed the whole flock, was their words, for a year rather than to fight them for a week. And so that's an important part of relocation is sometimes you hear about Indigenous peoples and you hear about reservations, and sometimes there's different misconceptions, that Indigenous peoples are so lucky to have reservations set aside for them. But understanding that reservations were created as a form of domestication. And in many reservations, there were forts with military bases that were there to ensure that Indigenous peoples were on their best behavior, that they didn't leave the reservation. And in some places there were barbed wire fences. Indigenous peoples were fed out of troughs. And so understanding what reservations actually mean and how they came to be. And so on April 8, 1864, the California Reservation Act mandated the establishment of 4 reservations throughout the state of California. And this was supposed to be to organize Indian affairs and to constitute kind of one Indian superintendency. And so it was declared that each reservation shall be located as remote from white settlements as may be practical, and each reservation must be supervised by an appointed Indian agent. And so this is part of that California Indian Reservation Act of 1864. So Indigenous men, women, children, and elders were violently stripped from their homelands and herded on foot to designated reservations. And I think that this picture here was painted by Peggy O'Neill, but it really kind of illustrates what that was like. I mean, you think about what we talked about before is Indigenous peoples have come into being in the places that they currently are. They're centers of the world. This is where they came into being, and that their people have been in those spaces from 12,000 years or more. And so when you think of the connection of being from the same place as your mothers were before you, and then to be stripped of that place, the place that you have this spiritual connection. And many people, and you hear testimonies of people hugging trees, not wanting to leave, that the spiritual energies of those places, the sacred sites, the gathering places, those loved ones that were buried there, all of these connections that families and children were stripped away from, and then herded on foot, sometimes hundreds of miles, to reservations. And during this time, there were people that didn't make those long walks. And there's stories about how the rest of the people would carry them. And so in thinking about this period of relocation and what that means, and how that impacted people. And so Once they arrived to the reservations, individuals were forbidden to bear arms, which kept them from not only protecting themselves, but also from self-sufficiency, food subsistence. Um, and consequently, each person had to rely on rations then from the federal government. So it became reliant on the federal government for these rations of salt, sugar, flour, and eventually alcohol that was provided to them. And so in some of these transitional stations, as I said before, the people were encased in barbed wire fencing and fed like animals through troughs. This is Fort Humboldt is one of those places, one such place as that. But once again, Indigenous people survived. And so these reservations were meant to domesticate Indigenous people. They were meant to tear them away from their identity, but yet Indigenous peoples survived. Soon after, a new era begins, which is colonial education. And so it seems like things just keep happening. But when we think of this basket that travels and it's traveling through each of these generations, each generation is surviving and they're utilizing their own Indigenous knowledge to be able to survive these events. And so when settlers from Spain, Great Britain, and France arrived in the United States, they interpreted Indigenous child rearing practices and beliefs and customs as being heathen, savage, unhealthy. And so in 1879, then Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who was a member of the Black Cavalry, he was a military man. He had this idea. He was actually in charge of many Indian prisoners. He had this idea that if you could civilize an Indigenous person or civilize an Indian by Christianizing them. And so he came up with this idea of boarding schools, and kind of the whole concept behind the boarding school was to kill the Indian, save the man. So shed everything about them that makes them an Indigenous person, Christianize them, and with that they will become human. And so to accomplish this task, hundreds of children were separated from their parents, taken away from their homelands, and forced into boarding school. And the first boarding school was Carlisle Indian School. And so many children were actually taken to Carlisle. But later, Indigenous Californians were sent to Hoopa Boarding School, which opened in 1896. And it's actually pictured on this slide here. And then also to Sherman Institute, which opened in 1902. And so upon arrival in these schools, children were had their hair cut. They were stripped of their regalia. They were supplied a uniform. They were given an English name from the Bible. They were forbidden to speak their native languages. They weren't allowed to have friendships or to be close to family members. And one boarding school survivor recalled seeing boys' spirits broken, as their braids hit the floor, that the braids, in his belief, held their spiritual knowledge and the power, and watching the braids of these boys just, hitting the floor. And so these boarding schools, and you can kind of see in this picture here, because Richard Henry Pratt was a military person, the schools ran on a military schedule. They had exercise drills, bells, the disciplinary action. Many of the schools were actually formerly forts. And so Fort Gaston, for example, then began, which is this fort here in Hoopa. Then it was transformed into a school. And so these schools had prisons at the bottom because they had been forts before. And so children would be put into those prisons as a form of a punishment for speaking their language or for having a friendship. And so there's also in this, when you think about, and we could have long discussions about exactly how each of these things impacted a child. When we think about a child being given a name from the Bible, for example, we could have a whole discussion about what a name means to us, how we're given our name, how we're connected to our name. It speaks to our identity. Even the fact I have a nickname. And when my parents call me my actual name and not my nickname, how it influences how I feel when they're talking. Like, I think, am I in trouble, or this is a real a serious situation? So just by the names people call us, how that impacts our identity. And so you can only imagine then having a totally different name now that you have no connection to, but that's your new name. Also, we could talk in more discussion about the cutting of hair and how significant that is, and that in many Indigenous cultures, hair is sacred, and that hair is only cut during certain times. One young man testified that in his culture, that when you had your hair cut, it symbolized a loss of a family member, and the shorter the cut, the closer the family member. And so when his head was shaved when he went in boarding school, he thought that his mother must have passed, and he grieved in that way when his hair was cut. Some of the children that were detached from their parents, some of them were as young as 6 months old that were taken into boarding schools. The majority were between 6 and 10 years old. And so the punishment also for many children, this was the first time that they had been, physically abused. Children, for speaking their language, had red hot needles put through their tongue, their mouth washed out with soap. Different types of punishments for speaking their language. I want to reiterate that most children that went to boarding school did not know English. They knew other Indigenous languages, but they did not know English. And so when they attempted to communicate with their teachers, they knew other language to communicate in. We also know that there was an outing system, and in this outing system, children were encouraged to live with non-Indigenous families in the community. And oftentimes this outing system turned into more servitude of Indigenous children that went into these programs as well. And in 1878, Estelle Real came along, and she was a new superintendent of boarding schools. And she came up with this kind of idea of the safety zone, where children could participate, could utilize their language, and could make regalia, which is something they were forbidden to do before, but they could only do it for 2 reasons: if it was for the entertainment of mainstream population, or if it was for the economic development of the school. In those cases, children could participate in cultural activities. And so then you have, during this period of time, a lot of children who are participating in plays and things to entertain the mainstream population. This is a whole nother discussion, but it leads to kind of this conditioning of society to see Indigenous peoples as entertainment and as something that can be consumed. And so that's something to keep into account, even though it's for another discussion. So another driving force to fulfilling the philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man, was that all Indians were considered savages and that they need to be civilized. This is one of the tenets of colonial education, and that civilization required Christian conversion. So as a result, children were given the biblical names, but they were also expected to convert to Christianity. And so Richard Henry Pratt stated that in Indian civilization, I'm Baptist because I believe in immersing the Indians in our civilization, and when we get them under, holding them there until they are thoroughly soaked. And so part of this, Indigenous peoples were forbidden to speak their Indigenous languages. And Winnie George, here on the slide in the first quote, and she was in boarding school in Hoopa in the 1920s, and she shares her experience. She says they didn't allow any of us kids to speak to one another in Indian. They didn't allow us to speak Indian at all. We had to speak English at all times. We had to do extra work if we spoke Indian, like iron or sweep the floor or scrub the floor. They actually had a little jail down there on the bottom. Sometimes if they was real bad, they'd spend 2-3 days in there, sometimes 1 week. And that was her testimony of her experience there in Hoopa. And so children who attempted to speak their home language in boarding schools were punished and given extra chores, sometimes put into the prison. And in addition, in the summer months, they had, as I said before, the outing system. And once again, in spite of being stripped of their families, culture, identity, and language, Indigenous peoples survived this. And I think that's really important to understand. There are thousands of children in both the United States and Canada that never returned home from boarding school and residential school. And that's part of the All Children Matters movement right now. Is these children that didn't return home, and some that were reports of children who were murdered. Well, they're still newborns, and often that happened from priests that had impregnated students, and those students had babies, and those babies were murdered. There's also looking at documentation that at least 100,000 children pass through the boarding school system, but 50% of those children completely perished. And I think that's another important thing to think about is when we talk about building trust, if your children are taken away from you and they're sent to a school, and there's this whole idea behind the school that it's going to civilize, make a better world for this child, and that child never returns home. How then do you establish a sense of trust with an institution? And when we think about trauma-informed care and establishing the sense of trust, we have to understand the experiences that Indigenous peoples have had with the government in previous times, and how that might impact the work that it takes to establish trust and to establish a sense of support and safety with children and families. Another quote that was written by Lakota John Fire in Memoirs of Attending Boarding School. He was 14 years old in 1917, and that's written here on the bottom is, in these fine new buildings, Indian children will still commit suicide because they are lonely among all the noise and activity. I know a 10-year-old who hanged herself. These schools are just boxes filled with homesick children. The schools leave a scar. We enter them confused and bewildered, and we leave them the same way. We enter school, we at least know that we're Indians. When we come out, half red and half white, not knowing what we are. And so this is kind of in looking at child's identity, is that we talked about in the module 2, worldview, that a child establishes their concept in the first 5 years, their values, their beliefs, their experiences, all the things that influence their interpretations of reality. And so these children had a very strong sense of who they are. And when they go into the school system and through the boarding schools, that it's being beaten out of them. And so now when they leave the school, they have this, what Vine Deloria refers to as a schizophrenic nature, where they're not sure where they fit in, and they're not sure what is important and what to believe. And so it's important to once again understand that boarding schools policy had changed for boarding schools in 1932 to transition into day schools, but still the philosophies of boarding school actually continued into the 30s and 40s, and still there's some aspects of resonance of boarding schools and the tenets of colonial education that you see within educational systems. But despite that, is to understand that Indigenous peoples are still here. Like, despite the attempts to shed Indigenous peoples of language and to shed Indigenous peoples of culture and of regalia, we still know and have and participate in with Indigenous peoples and speaking our languages and participating in ceremony and making regalia and having connections to the natural environment. And it makes you realize the intergenerational strength within Indigenous communities to be able to persevere and to be able to survive through all of these experiences. And once again, we think about the basket, that basket with the Indigenous knowledge that the people of that generation picked up the knowledge, they learned from it, and they too added knowledge to it as well and sent it on for the next generation. And so now here we are in this period of self-determination. And we have these discussions here, and we know we've talked about this before in the very first module, is that Indigenous students and Indigenous communities consistently rank below average in high school completion, standardized test scores, grade point average, college admittance, school attendance. We've talked about these things. And we know that Indigenous people have a higher alcoholism rate. We talked about 514%, a higher suicide rate, which is at 1,000% higher, diabetes incidences, which is 177% higher. And we talked about tuberculosis incidences at 500% higher. Even youth arrest rates, 300% higher. And we also talked about how violence accounts for 75% of deaths among Indigenous children ages 12 to 20. But although we have some of the most alarming statistics, and sometimes in the world, we talk about and we think about this resilience, that in the face of blatant genocide, bounties to be hunted, policies to enslave, literal permission to kidnap, and the governmental powers to physically and sexually abuse Indigenous children, that Indigenous California people have persevered. And when we look at, during this phase of genocide, that the population of Indigenous Californians decreased from 1 million to 17,000 in a 50-year period. So you're looking at 983,000 Indigenous peoples who perished. And 10,000 of those survivors were committed to slavery. So during the phase of relocation, Indigenous peoples were torn from their homelands to become domesticated. And during the phase of colonial education, children were traumatically taken from their families and stripped of everything that they loved. And yet the people survived. So the basket that we're talking about, the Chem-Tem basket, the treasures of our people, the knowledge of our people that the woman wove that contained all of those treasures, the songs, the language, the history, the stories. Throughout each phase of education, Indigenous Californians fought to survive. And within the strength of the treasure, which some might call genetic memory, the people persisted. And so every living Indigenous Californian is a direct descendant of one of those 17,000 survivors of genocide. And so, like the basket that flowed down the river that we're describing, the treasures of our people flows through their veins. And I think that that's a real important concept when we think about this current phase of self-determination, because Indigenous Californians strive to pick up the basket, to rejoice in the lessons, and to make a contribution for future generations to come. And because of that, we have language revitalization programs, restoration of ceremony, revival of basket making, regalia making, preservation of culture, reconnecting and reclaiming homelands. And all of this are efforts to protect the treasure. So when we think about what's happening in this period of time now, it's in response to this journey of the basket and to protect that knowledge, to revitalize the knowledge and to learn more about our peoples. And so we have programs that are looking at protection of inherent rights, looking at application of traditional ecological knowledge, revitalization or revivification, breathing a new life into CAM-TEM. And so then once again, we revisit this slide, trauma-informed care principles. So now with this new information that we've talked about here in this discussion, and we've talked about all of these phases, and we've talked about what experiences each generation has had. With those things in mind, how do we establish the physical and emotional safety of patients and staff? How would we do that? And even if you're not in the medical field and thinking about establishing physical and emotional safety of your students or of your clients. And how do we build trust between providers and patients? What does that look like? And how do we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma exposure on physical and mental health? So these are all things in keeping in mind that in order to be trauma-informed care, to provide trauma-informed care, that we really have to understand where our clients are coming from. What is not only their history, but the history of their community that influences them.